I'm Isaac Shub. I work at the New Haven Free Public Library, and that's where I'm sitting right now. And I'm here with Professor Adolph Reed. Um, Adolph Reed is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. And he has also held faculty positions at Yale, Northwestern, the University of Chicago, and the New School. His books include Class Notes, Posing as Politics and Other Thoughts on the American Scene, Stirrings in the Jug, Black Politics in the Post-Segregation Era, and the Jesse Jackson Phenomenon, The Crisis of Purpose in Afro-American Politics. His writing frequently appears in publications like The New Republic, The Nation, Jacobin, Common Dreams, and the New Labor Forum, among many others. And he's very kindly come to visit us today for a book sandwiched in session. So just before we started, people may not know this, if they're local to New Haven, but you were telling me that you lived in New Haven for 17 years while you were on the faculty at Yale.
Right. While I was on the faculty at Yale, and then when I moved back from Chicago, I lived in New Haven when I was on the faculty at the New School in New York. So.
And you took your son to the New Haven Public Library.
Often, and he went to Wilbur Cross and to Hamden Hall. So we're deeply rooted and played in the baseball leagues in New Haven from the Little League through high school.
Mm-hmm. So I guess like in having you here, I kind of I was really struck when I encountered your writing by the clarity that it had, and it resonated with a lot of things that I had been mulling over but hadn't really had the words for. So I don't know if this is something you've talked about in a while, but I was reading your book Class Notes, and you mentioned the term infra-politics. Mm-hmm. And that was a term that was coined by this political anthropologist, James Scott, to describe the reactions of the peasantry living under autocratic rule in Malaysia in the 70s to the rich.
Right.
So those are, if I'm not incorrect, those are everyday behaviors of resistance that are widespread. And he kind of characterizes that as character assassination and gossip and rumor and vague threats. So that's not a term that we hear a lot about, unlike identity politics.
Right.
Can you help explain how that informs your analysis of U.S. political behavior today?
Sure. Jim was, of course, my colleague and my friend, but and the infra-politics notion in itself makes sense. The problem with it is that the tendency of other scholars to see the 50-cent bet on the table and raise it $100,000, because Jim's clear that that the kinds of activities that occur in this domain that he describes as infra-politics is not precisely political, right? Thus, it's like an infra-politics. It's a kind of activity that's what's what I'm looking for, that is consistent with the observation that people who are oppressed understand that they're oppressed, and the cliche, for instance, a slogan that wherever there's oppression, there's resistance, and that makes sense. But then, but what's happened both within the academy and in non-academic public discourse about this is that people have tended, and this again was a product of like the 80s and 90s, to expand the notion of what should count as political action to include the sphere of infra-politics, which of course by definition is not political action, right? It can be a precursor of the political action, mm-hmm. But someplace, I think maybe in Class Notes, but I've done the same thing someplace else more recently. I've made the comparison to carbon and water being essential precursors to the emergence of life on our planet. But because there's carbon and water around doesn't mean that there's going to be a Homo sapiens, right, the next day. So infra politics doesn't really tell us anything other than what for some of us is a cliche that people know that they're oppressed and they don't like it, and they find ways to create dignity for themselves or space for themselves. But I think that the proliferation of the infrapolitics idea is like an expression of a broader problem, which I think is like a banalization of the idea of the political, for instance, by inflating the currency so that anything that you do, you can say as a form of political resistance.
So any, posts on Facebook,
right, wearing your baseball cap backward.
Those are token acts of
right.
Of politics. Right. They're not really political acts.
Right. I would argue that they're not. Right.
And so I guess kind of what I wanted to cover today was how you talk about that sort of thing and how we kind of move, if we can, if we still have hope to, from those sorts of small acts of resistance to a more organized politics that enacts, strategic objectives.
Right. Well, I tell you, my friend and comrade Mark Dudzik and I did an article in the Socialist Register in 2015, I think, that assesses the state of the labor movement and class politics in the U.S. as of that point. And one notion that we hammered on is that when we talk about a political movement, we mean something that's kind of specific, and it's like a relatively coherent force that has the capacity to influence the terms of substantive political debate and public policy, right? And is made up of real people, right, including, and of course is rooted like in institutions, and the institutions themselves are in part comprised by people who have names and addresses, right? So it's not like you speak, like I can sort of get the public microphone and speak on behalf of a mute mass and call that a movement, but that happens a lot. And by that standard, at least on the left, there hasn't been anything approximating a serious political movement in this country in 30 years, probably.
Yeah, so that's, when you talk about, one of the articles I read more recently that, made a really strong impression on me was in the Baffler. It was called The Trouble with Uplift.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of things were happening politically at that time, and still are. Right. But an upsurge of the Black Lives Matter movement, the rise of Trump.
Right.
And a lot of us are still trying to sort out, how exactly should we look at, say the storming of the Capitol and, who's to blame here? What are the causes? What are the effects? But like to kind of go backwards, you first start out by talking about a movement in the 60s and 70s towards an identity politics or culture first politics that's using figureheads and sort of empowering them with omniscience to speak on behalf of groups of people. And in so doing, you're saying, well, no, you belong in that group. You don't really give people a choice. Can you talk about like the history of that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, my colleague Kenneth Warren, who's an English professor at the University of Chicago, has written very clearly about this in a quite interesting book I'd recommend for everybody who's listening, called What Was African American Literature? And he makes the point that what we think of as Black literature or Black politics even is an historically specific phenomenon that emerged first and at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, at precisely the moment when rank and file Black people were being disfranchised in the South. right? So the idea of that Black people pursue their political interests secondarily through a literature that advances the image of the race or speaks for the generic racial interests of a population kind of took root then. And as Warren argues, and I've argued too, as have others, is that that's a specifically class-skewed notion, or it's a class-rooted notion. And it's a notion that's rooted in the sensibility of a class that understood itself, and I mean a social class and political and economic class, that understood itself to be the natural bearers of the interests of the race as a totality. That was also, people forget, like in the late 19th and very early 20th century, very much linked to the dominant race theories of the time, which were, and the so-called race science, right? Notions that that races are the fundamental units of power and of human organization, right? Despite the fact that, and this is another mantra, that two generations of the study of genetics have demonstrated that there are no subspecies level populations, right, among Homo sapiens that are larger than the local breeding group, right, like your particular bloodline. But the belief, the almost universal conviction was that race was the way the world was organized, and that races were joined by what were sometimes referred to as group ideals. So, and this was all, sort of really, I mean, abstract stuff that we can say now is hooey, and it was hooey at the time. But the problem is that the hooey that everybody believes doesn't get treated as hooey, right? But though anyway, so for these reasons, like it made sense, right, for a self-referential stratum of the population who had access to philanthropic support and to a public voice that the masses of free people didn't have, especially because of disfranchisement. So it rolls on, right? And the notion of Black politics as sort of speaking for an undifferentiated racial population took shape, and then in the post-World War II years, kind of blended, nicely with interest group pluralist politics, right, like in the U.S. And what we have all come to understand now as Black politics, right, is in fact this historically specific expression of urban interest group politics that developed in the U.S. in the over the couple of decades after World War II. So from that perspective, I guess I would say that a part of the warrant is that notions like a trans-historical Black freedom movement, a trans-historical Black liberation struggle, really don't help us understand anything. Don't help us understand the historical specificities and the real tensions and conflicts and objectives that have shaped and driven Black American political life since the end of the 19th century.
Yeah, well, I think it was what I was noticing in myself. I grew up in New Haven, and I went to the public schools here, and then I went to a fancy liberal arts college in Ohio, and I was there for a few years, and then I took a little time off away from college. And when I came back around fall of 2015, it felt like the political mood was really different. Mm-hmm. Black Lives Matter was gaining steam, after the killing of Michael Brown and Eric Garner by police, and Trump was running for office. And so I thought, as students, we should be protesting and organizing, but and I fault myself in this, but there weren't campus protests, spreading across the country. But our college did make the times for complaints about culturally appropriated food in the dining halls.
I remember.
And then Yale had, some students at Yale were infuriated about Halloween costumes or a statement on them.
Right.
So the right-wing media had a field day over that kind of thing.
Right.
So is that, you see that as related, I think, to.
Oh yeah, definitely. Right. And I'd go farther. I'd say that, I've worked in South Carolina for a long time. And one of the things that I noticed there more than a decade ago is that both the Democrats and Republicans have an interest in race being the central fault line in politics, right? In fact, a good friend of mine there, and a comrade I work with there, who's also a political scientist, also retired, a couple of years ago, went back and revisited political scientist V.O. Key's classic Southern Politics in State and Nation that was published in 1949. And he read me a section from Key's description of South Carolina, and was struck that with just some word changes here and there, you could say basically the same thing about the role that race plays in South Carolina now as Key said in 1949. And the main difference would be that that both sides of the partisan divide are equally committed to race being the central fault line. And we've seen that more since really, since the defeat of the Sanders campaign in 2020, right? The combination of, well, the pandemic's not really that, well, I mean, the pandemic is part of it as well. But but I think the real flashpoint was the murder of George Floyd. And there's no question that that was horrendous. There's no question in my mind it was murder. I can't imagine what else you'd call it. But what we've noticed, though, is that a kind of steady drumbeat. I got up this morning and I noticed that first, a ProPublica study that raises the alarm that the preferential or giving priority to 75-year-olds in dissemination of the coronavirus vaccine is racially discriminatory because Black people are less likely to live to be 75. And then I looked at Crane's business and found that McDonald's has just pledged itself to increase diversity in top-level management. So by, I think, 2025, they want to have gone from 29% of the underrepresented groups on the top tier of management to, to 35%. But just a kind of steady, and the original focus, I mean, I'm sure everyone recalls the standard account of the problem with the coronavirus pandemic was the racially disparate impact of its consequences, right? Both the rates of infection and mortality. Well, and like I wrote a little piece in Common Dreams about this, and my friend Merlin Chalkwanian, who's a public health historian at Columbia, and I did another piece for the New England Journal of Medicine, pointing out that, well, in the first place, it's like way too early, right, to make any like definitive judgment about this. In the second place, we should be cautious about making claims that the disease has racially different impact, right? Because that just takes us back to that old 19th century race science that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and there was nothing good that was associated with that, and a lot of harm. And so, but it goes on and over and over and over. It's a steady drumbeat every day from the New York Times, from public interest groups, from there's a liberal public health listserv I've been on for years called The Spirit of 1948 or of 1848. And every day, right, there are more and more postings documenting the apparent racial disparity. Well, then it turns out about a month or so ago, there were a couple of bigger studies that found that, well, the reason that Blacks and Hispanics are more likely to be infected and more likely to suffer badly when they are infected has to do with the kind of work they do and where they live and underlying health conditions that are associated with poor access to healthcare, which is what we've been saying from the very beginning. So then the question is, and like this is where I'll get my own conspiratorial thing on. The question is, why? Why is like the straight racial narrative so appealing to people in a position to shape the public discourse? One thing is, I think that it doesn't, well, that the racial narrative doesn't open to any particular response, right? It just says, oh, well, yeah, it's bad, so we need to combat with the racism, but so what does that mean? But more deeply, I believe that, because you remember too, that in the summer, some of the worst, most rapacious and disgusting corporations in America were falling all over themselves, giving money to Black Lives Matter and other anti-racist groups. Uber, for instance, Jeff Bezos, right, and his empire, and people who sort of treat their workers of color horribly, but at the same time want to demonstrate their anti-racist props. And I think that a lot of it comes down to a more or less self-conscious elite concern to wipe the Sanders moment off the historical record, right? And yeah, I mean, I'll admit I worked in both Sanders campaigns. But the striking thing about 2020 to me was like, in addition to the way that the mainstream Democrats made clear from the very beginning that there was no way that they would let Sanders get the nomination, basically. Yeah. But that I think in like 20 straight primaries, no matter how well Sanders did, and we were in South Carolina working, and he got his clock clean there. But even in South Carolina, a majority of voters in the Democratic primary said that they favored Medicare for all, right? So from that perspective, and then just watching how things have gone, and I apologize for the rambling rant, but just watching how things have gone politically in the political discourse over the last eight months, say, or really close to a year. It just feels like a sort of concerted, again, almost a bipartisan effort to take economic inequality out of political discussion and to replace it, right, with like different expressions of identity politics. And I'll say one more thing about that too, if it's okay, that the notion that there's a right-wing populism out there, that conservatives have been able to appeal to, partly because liberals don't appeal to the white and the working class. I want to address that because there are a couple of problems there. One of them is that the construct in that discourse racializes the working class, right? I mean, so the working class becomes white when like most or the actual class of people who work for a living, right, with no supervisory role or a very limited capacity to define the nature of their own work is disproportionately black and Hispanic and female, but of course it's also very largely white. But the working class is like not a racial population, but this discourse tries to make it one, right? Which is textbook, right? Like divide and conquer from the 19th century, right? And the idea that what workers are, or what white workers are concerned with is not economic issues, but values and moral issues, right, is another sort of bipartisan fiction, right? And a bipartisan fiction, the objective of which on both sides is to take economic inequality off the table. And what's frightening about that, I think, is that the more that Democrats refuse to address the real problems of economic inequality in the society and to pat themselves on the back about being woke, right? Like I still kind of chuckle to myself at that photo. I'm sure a lot of people saw of Pelosi and Schumer and a bunch of others in Congress with the kente cloth stole, taking a knee like they're at a Kappa Alpha Psi step show, basically. The more space that gives the right to try to mobilize around a nasty vision, and really all my political work has been for a long time, but especially this is why we're in South Carolina, has been like to demonstrate that if you address working people honestly and directly about the everyday concerns that they feel and experience as they experience them, that's the route we have to go to build a movement, and we can build a movement in that way. Last thing I'll say about this, just to complete the circle on the rant, I guess, is that, again, like I've been asking for 30 years probably, how it is that we're supposed to be able to generate the kind of political solidarities that we need to have if we want to tackle the real sources of economic inequality in this society, if we have to start by going around the room to establish how it is we all differ from one another instead of what we have in common. So, I mean, maybe that's given like folks in the audience some food for or fuel, right? Comments and questions, but.
Yeah, so I want to say we're totally open to comments and questions. We have a few here. I just want to say, if there's people who are, may not be familiar with this kind of thought, especially being kind of blanketed in exactly the sort of kind of culture first politics that you talk so much about. I don't think you're at all saying, oh no, people's you're not spouting kind of Rush Limbaugh racist stuff.
No.
What you're kind of saying, what are the true causes here? What are the effects? And sure, representation looks nice, and it may help a few people who are in the Biden administration. It may be morally uplifting to some others. Right. But what about the great mass of people, who as a people are, in this country struggling, regardless of the color of their skin or their gender or any number of other identifiers.
Right. Well, I'll tell you this too, like, so, Chris Rock, the comedian, around the O.J. Simpson trial in the mid-90s, said in a nice bit, he said that the OJ case was not about race, it was about money. And he said, if an OJ had been a bus driver, then he would now be known as Orenthal, the bus driver murderer. And then he said that's why he thought that was so crazy that when the jury acquitted him, Black people all around the country were cheering like we had won. And Rock said, I went to my mailbox every day for 3 weeks looking for my OJ prize, and it never came. And I mention that because, so the demand that more Black filmmakers and actors get Oscars, right? But I'm just, I've always tried to imagine how I could take that to Stop and Shop, right? To pay my groceries, right? And that's not, but yeah, I mean, and I tell you, like a conservative political scientist named James Q. Wilson did a book on Black politics in Chicago that came out in 1960. And he argued, which was already sort of commonplace understanding, not just about race, but about urban politics in the US, that groups will come together and make demands on local government that could be articulated in the direction of demands for redistribution or changing patterns of distribution. The natural systemic process, as he points out, is to turn potentially redistributed demands into symbolic demands, so that it's a lot easier to contain an appointment to a commission, right, or an appointment of a judge, right, or placing a statute, for instance, right, or getting rid of a statute, right, as has been happening down this part of the country, right. It's a lot easier and cheaper for that to be the metric of justice and equality than stuff that actually connects with people's lives and livelihoods. And again, that's the bipartisan consensus thing, right? I mean, I just saw, I was disappointed to learn a couple of days ago that Biden has said no to student loan forgiveness up to $50,000, but I was even more frustrated, maybe even, I don't know, disgusted a little bit, to learn his reason, because his reasoning was that, well, people who are likely to have accumulated that much in student loan debt are people who are likely to have gone to fancy colleges, right? And I don't want to, who will therefore make more money in their lives, and I don't want to subsidize people who have gone to fancy colleges. And this is a direct read forward from Clinton's claim that she didn't want to pay for, she opposed free public higher ed, which, by the way, is one of the several items from the Sanders platform that came directly out of our old program in the Labor Party, right, from the late 90s, and that's great. But she didn't want to pay. She didn't support free public on higher ed because she didn't want to pay for Donald Trump's kids to go to college. Well, that sounds radical or whatever, or progressive, but the reality is that Donald Trump's kids are never going to go to a public college anyway, right? They all go to Penn, right? And if it weren't Penn, it would be some other private college. And actually when we were doing the free public higher ed campaign and talked to faculty unions, right, at public institutions, every now and then somebody and typically somebody like from my era and some sort of old new leftist would say, well, I don't know, I don't think it should be like a universal program because you'd be subsidizing rich people's kids. And I say, well, like they can go to public high schools, they can ride on public roads, right? I mean, and if it's public, it's public. And plus, I mean, like I said, like there's like a layer of bullshit private colleges out there for the underachieving students or children of rich people that they go to get a pedigree, like before they would go to SCSU, for instance, right? but that just says something about like the mindset, and somehow, you know, over the last close to 40 years now, right? Even within the Democratic Party, means testing, as opposed to universal programs, has become the marker of progressive politics. That only the poorest. Now we need to take care of the poorest first. Well, sure, but how about we just sort of drop the first and say take care of the poorest while taking care of everybody, right? Because the history of the Social Security program and of Medicare show that the best way to protect a benefit that disproportionately helps poor people is to make it a universal benefit. So I know I'm all over the place, but
no, it's great. So there's a number of questions here, but before I get to them, I just want to ask you one more question that kind of touches on what I've been calling the storming of the Capitol on January 6th.
Right.
And I was just reading an article in the Times that was about rooting out so-called extremism or white supremacy in police forces. Right. So it seems to me immediately it's like this, you know, is extremism is an abstract idea, and it's very difficult to combat extremism.
Right.
It's something that we've been attempting to do for the last couple decades, and
right.
It's like how do you combat racism? Are there concrete steps you can take? You know, because rooting out extremism is pretty abstract.
Right.
And it kind of raises the question, well, why are these police forces attracting such people or nurturing or growing them in the first place?
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's a very important point. But and the way you put it is very important too, because I've I've been saying for a while now that a politics of anti-racism is kind of like a politics of anti-terrorism. Because the object, and the same applies obviously to extremism, because the object isn't anything concrete. It's like an abstraction and a normative disposition, right? So that the beauty of a war against terror is that it has no object. It has no clearly unspecified target, and it can go on forever, right? Which like works for DynCorp, right, and the rest of them. And you can say the same thing about anti-racism, right? Because what's an anti-racist politics? I mean, and people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram Kendi and others who are the principal proponents of this kind of politics now, always when you get to the point, okay, what can we do? There's no clear response, right? Or Robin DiAngelo, right? Or I mean the rest of that ilk, except buy this book. I'm listening to this program. Go to this group session. Hire this consultant, right? On the extremism thing, well, we've known for a while, right, that neo-Nazi groups of whatever sort have been actively recruiting in the military. We've known for a while that they've been recruiting in police forces. There are people who have the disposition to be police. Some, I mean, not everybody, but some people who have the disposition to be police are people who also have the disposition toward an authoritarian politics, right? I mean, like that. I want to say about, because this has also been like an issue that I've been kind of concerned about, like in some circles of the left, a tendency to diminish the significance of what that event was on the 6th of January. Mm-hmm. It was a 2-bit game show host version of a coup, but it was a coup. It was an attempted coup, right? And I mean, I've often said that Trump is actually much closer to Andy Griffith's character in A Face in the Crowd than he was to Hitler. And that's what he had going for him, right? That he couldn't couldn't imagine being able to organize anything or whatever. But those forces are out there, and they've been emboldened. And frankly, since the 6th, well, actually, since the trial, I've been more concerned about the responses coming from the establishment of the Republicans now, and even like the Republican public officials in Texas, because the lesson that they seem to have taken from all of this is that they can say whatever they want without a wit's regard of its connection to any plausible truth, but they can sell it, right? I mean, when the mayor of this city in Texas complains that citizens who are asking him for assistance, right? Or when the governor of Texas and the former governor of Texas blame the Green New Deal for a problem that they clearly caused, we're in trouble, right? And I think I think that we're coming closer to a point, and this connects with my first long rant, where well, not just here, but like in other places in the world, that we may be getting to a point where, as a political economic order, what we think of as neoliberalism is like losing its capacity to deliver enough to enough of the population to be able to continue to sustain itself as a nominally democratic order. And from that perspective, there are really only two directions to go in. One of them is toward a straight authoritarianism, like we've seen in Poland, Hungary, India, now, I mean, Brazil tried it through coups elsewhere, like in Latin America, or to move in the direction of a more explicitly social democratic orientation, where we sort of fight for a vision of government that's based on as a primary responsibility tending to the public good, right? And I'm very much concerned that because frankly, the central or the dominant wing, like the Democratic Party, is so long ago itself forsaken that public good approach to government in its alliance, like with neoliberals, that I'm afraid that we're so far behind in trying to organize, the kind of movement that we need to advance or to press for a social democratic approach. And the right is so far ahead and so well funded, and with such, and with their own version of like the ultra right wing Juncker's class in Germany, that that it's kind of a race against time. But the problem with the race against time is that saying that is it's also this inclination among leftists to say, well, we don't have time for that slow drip kind of organizing, but there's no alternative to it. So we have to do it. Excuse me. Anyway, sorry.
No, very helpful. So there's a number of questions here, and I'm tempted to ask you about. Someone has a question about Obama's whether you consider his term in part a success of disarming the progressive thrust of the African American community. It says specifically here, and people should know you wrote incredibly presciently about Barack Obama in 1996, I think, in the Village Voice.
Well, I mean, I actually wrote it like in 95, and it came out in January 96. But I always make this point, though, that I have found that it can be more helpful to be in the right place at the right time and keep your eyes open than to be smart. And with Obama, like I just happened to be quite accidentally. I sometimes describe it as in the birthing room at the outset of his political career. I watched it up close and personal. So it's not like I was pressing. I just saw what I was dealing with.
And what Professor Reed is describing, if you haven't heard it, is in an essay in his book, Class Notes, he writes about a young labor organizer and the kind of politics that he represents as being more neoliberal, meaning, really going to be providing more assistance in the long run to corporations, basically, than to people, to put it in extremely simple terms.
No, that's right.
But that he has kind of a patina of democracy about him. But I guess, to try to be, I should try to be more optimistic. In moving forward, someone asks, do you see a possibility of a renaissance of the American Labor Party, continuing the work of Henry Wallace, Vito Marcantonio, and Tony Mazzocchi?
Right. Well, it's funny because my dad was part of the American Labor Party too, and he wrote his graduate work on it. Well, I assume like the questioner knows. Well, yeah, you mentioned Tony, that we did that, right? Like we had an experiment in the 90s. Like it took basically, it was my preoccupation, like for 15 years, to try to build like an independent working class party based in the trade union movement in the U.S. And it's tough. I don't think it's time to try it again. I think the key is, and the advantage that we had that when we tried was that the labor movement more broadly was in an insurgent moment, right after NAFTA and the change in the leadership of the AFL-CIO. By the end of the century, the labor movement had gone into retreat again, and fact is that you can't have a labor party without the labor movement, right? So, though we did win a ballot line in South Carolina that we still have, so we could run candidates there if we want. I think the real answer is that there will have to be some different kind of formulation. Or formation, excuse me, right? Some people think the Democratic Party can be transformed from within. Maybe I tend to think not, but something's going to have to happen. But I think whatever happens on a large scale is going to grow out of the organizing efforts that people undertake now. And I think one of the big changes in the left over the last 30, 40 years or so, like in the US, is a retreat from a substantive vision that the society can be qualitatively better than it is now, and that we can actually reorganize institutions, right? And I think that's something else that needs to be, that's a way of thinking about politics that needs to be rekindled. And it's not just, a fanciful notion, right? But you've got, and see, this is one of the ways that the right has been able to outflank us. They have a very clear understanding of what they want the society to be like. And it's one that most of us here aren't going to be in, so it's to be clear. But they know where they want to go, and our side doesn't. And they think strategically, and our side doesn't quite so much. And there's a way that I'm trying to choose my words carefully here, because there are strains in the left also that see doing anything with the Democrats as a deal with the devil. I'm not saying that either. Like, these are tactical measures. Although my son reminded me that the first vote that he ever cast in his life in 1988 was for a Republican, Lowell Weicker against Joe Lieberman. And I think we're both proud to say that we've never voted for Joe Lieberman for anything whatsoever. but
I've shaken his hand and still regret it. So
right.
as a kid.
Well, and plus it was easy to vote for Ralph in 2002, but still, or at least it was easy to vote for Ralph in Connecticut in 2000, right? So yeah, I mean, like, ultimately, here's the way I see it: that we need to concentrate on trying to build a working class movement, or a working class based movement, or a transformative political movement rooted in the working class, right? And the broad working class, as like we used to define it in the Labor Party, everybody who has to work for a living, right? Or is expected to work for a living. And as we build that movement, the movement is going to generate institutional forms and the mechanisms, but the movement's key. I tell you, like, this happened more in the 2016 campaign than the 2020 one, because I worked more with young people in the 2016 campaign. But I'm sure a lot of them got tired of hearing this old man's story. But I would invoke the case of Sergeant Pavlov at the Battle of Stalingrad. And Pavlov was this young guy who, with like, I think 43, a company of 43 soldiers from many different Russian or Soviet nationalities, who held one building for more than a month against daily Nazi assaults and multiple assaults daily. And the moral of the Pavlov story was they had one job, and that one job was to hold that building, because it was like the last line of defense that kept the Nazis from reaching the banks of the Volga. And I would say to the young people, so when you get all who would get jacked out of shape about, you know, poll results from California or what just happened in Wisconsin, that the point isn't to be abreast of the news. The point is to have a task to build a movement in this sector in your world every day, and that's where your focus needs to be, and that's something else that we need.
This is a question that I don't know if I understand, but you might. And it is, what do you make of the increasingly popular post-human turn in the academy? Is anthropocentrism a fundamental problem of neoliberal capitalism, one that is neglected by the left today? Or is a turn to the non-human another liberal obfuscation of class struggle? Oh,
that's interesting. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll start out with an anecdote, and it's a Labor Party one. In like 96 and 97, I was in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where my father taught, and I was out to visit him. And he and some of his buddies had organized like a Labor Party meeting for us. And there, in attendance was a woman who was a staffer at the NPR affiliate, and she was intrigued. She was a Green, and she was intrigued by the idea that the Labor Party had an environmental program, and of course, you know, our core union was the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, and they. If anybody should be concerned about environmental degradation, it's like those workers. But she wanted to interview me because she was intrigued. And when we were talking before she started taping the next day, she was just trying to situate me in the political taxonomy in her head. So there's nothing contentious about this. But when I explained what our position was, she said, "Oh, so I guess you're really just like the other anthropocentric parties." And I thought, yeah, but when the raccoons get their demands together, you know, they can bring them to us, and we can see what the points at which we unite and don't. But I'm not saying that like to trivialize the question either, right? I mean, no, like we aren't like the center of the universe. And it helps not to see ourselves in that way. I don't think that the 13th Amendment ought to apply to orcas. Actually, I think that there are species distinctions that make sense, not the least for not the least of the reasons I think that is that I think it's very that one of the definitions of species difference is in or inability to communicate effectively across species difference, right? And a very good friend of mine wrote an ethnography of the Bay Area the Bay Area animal rights movement back in the early 80s, and she actually found, and she's herself a physical and a biological anthropologist, but she found people who said that they prefer to agitate on behalf of non-human animals because the latter are put it kind of crudely, blameless, but they're also mute, right? So you don't have to worry about having a black power moment, right, in the movement. You get to, right? I mean, speak for non-human animals like forever. But so I wouldn't say that the turn to the post-human in the academy is a willed diversion from pursuit of a left politics. I think it does make sense for us, to sort of decenter as much as possible in practical terms, Homo sapiens in the world. Though at the same time, though, I think we should be just as concerned about poultry workers as we are about the quality of life of the chickens in the poultry factory.
Sure. Here's another question, which is a little more concrete, and that is, what do you think of the effort to flip Georgia or Unite Here's electoral efforts with laid-off union members as a model for base building? Stacey Abrams and others do have some corporate Democrat characteristics. At the same time, some of the on-the-ground work seems like the real deal. Do you think there can be electoral work that's also productive organizing? What groups on the ground do you think are doing the right thing? And I guess if we can, since we're getting a little close to the hour here, tie in this question of how does one balance an academic life with the work of organizing?
Oh, okay. I think, and I don't know if the questioner knows this, but I've been close to Unite Here as a union for a long time. And the work that they did in 2020 was just absolutely extraordinary. And Dee Taylor would have been my candidate for the labor secretary post. I think a couple of things. I think it's easy to make too much of the work that Abrams and those people did, right? I mean, I was looking at something a couple of days ago about Georgia that suggests that that what flipped Georgia was less the work of Black voter registration and mobilization than the kind of demographic shift in the suburban counties, right? Like this is an anecdote to be sure, but I lived in Atlanta for a big chunk of the 70s, and the whole time I was there, Cobb County was divided like into two congressional districts, one of which was Newt Gingrich's, and the other was represented until he died on KAL 007 missile attack, which was fitting. A guy named Larry McDonald, who at that point was the only out member of the John Birch Society in Congress. And Cobb County was the symbol of white upper status reactionary politics, right, in Georgia, and was one of the counties actually in suburban counties that Lisa McGurr identified as a central breeding ground for the new right in her book, Suburban Warriors. But my son's best friend from his youth in Atlanta, was telling him that out in Cobb County now, and it's still about as white as it was. Black Lives Matter signs are out all over the place. So there is that kind of demographic change that's going on in the South. But I'll say this. Here's where the rub is, where the translation from electoral mobilization to movement organizing lies. Jane McAlevey, who's like another former nutmeg state activist, like we met in the late 90s in the context of a big fight down in Stanford. But Jane, in her most recently published book, No Shortcuts, makes a crucial distinction between mobilizing and organizing. And it's simply this, like, mobilizing is gathering up the people whom you already have contacts with and I mean directing their action towards some goal. And that's what electoral work really always comes down to, right? And I mean, that's its strength, that's its limit. And you can't build a movement through electoral work, because one of the things that you're always looking to do is find the least common denominator that will help you to unite as broad as possible and alliance as you can, and to move quickly. And one of the sort of strengths of the Sanders campaign, and also like an objective limit that its strength was an effort to overcome, it is that Sanders was trying to use an electoral campaign to jumpstart the organization of a political movement. And he was brilliant at it, but it can only go so far. And what happened when they pulled the rug out from under him, after the Nevada victory shows the limits. That's not his fault. It's if it's a fault of anything, it's a fault of the objective circumstances he's trying to overcome.
Yeah.
And I mean, organizing is like a much slower and more painstaking project of building the relationships with people, and it's more like selling Amway, right? I mean, than it is like getting people to go to the polls, right? So yeah, I mean, like, it's encouraging, but like the Maoists used to say, but we need to be able to walk on two legs, right? To do both the electoral stuff and the organizing stuff at the same time. So I hope that's an adequate response.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we're running up here against 1 p.m. and I don't want to keep you longer than you're due.
Okay.
Do you have time for another question or two?
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Let's see. So somebody says, thank you so much for being here, Professor. You're saying that a lot of the racialized narrative around the disparities in COVID disproportionately affecting people of color is exaggerated as a bid to distract from the consequences of years of systemic economic oppression coming to pass. Do you think this is intentional or more of a subconscious denial among the media class?
Well, that's a good question. And it's a question that it's almost impossible to avoid. I mean, like when I went to graduate school, one of the questions that I took with me was whether, the mainstream, the articulators of mainstream American political science ways of understanding power in the U.S. was something that they really believed or not. And I never got an answer to that question, even as several of them were my colleagues at Yale. And I mean, and like, this is a point where I think one of my dad's many dicta comes in handy, right? Because he always said that sincerity is vastly overrated as a virtue, right? Because nobody ever really sets out consciously to do malign things, right? So I guess that's a short way of saying, yeah, I don't know, but it doesn't make any difference because it comes out to the same outcome anyway. And I mean, that's not to dismiss the question. I think it's a question that's more important for a biographer or a confessor, basically, than for somebody who's trying to figure out the politics. But it is fascinating, though, that it sometimes doesn't make any difference, right? Because the conjunction of the political forces is such, like I've been thinking about this like in a different context about, you know, ways of behavior that look like they could be the work of political provocateurs or a policeman, right? But don't have to be, right? So, and there's a lot of that going on too.
Another question we have is, with the Republicans becoming more conservative and being influenced by groups like the Tea Party and even QAnon, while neoliberalism is taking over the Democratic Party, do you think we're approaching the end of the Democratic Party system as we know it now?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I think we could be approaching like the end of the Democratic small d system as we know it now. And I think that's a real danger. And I think, look, to be totally tendentious about it, the ruling class's commitment to democracy, and by the ruling class, I mean like economically powerful interests. I mean commitments to you know, democracy are have been won from underneath, right? They've been pressured to accept it, right? Like mass franchise, the idea of free labor as we understand it now, all were won from below at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in the US, and later than that, like in other places. And I think there are two conditions under which those elements in the society could find authoritarianism, I mean, desirable. One is when they have when they feel a threat from below, from the left, as in Germany and elsewhere in Europe in the 30s. But another that's kind of less explored is when they just think they can do it, without any cavil or balking. And again, it's not intentional. I think that this is just the trajectory of historical forces over the last 4 to 5 decades. Right. But we've been moving in a direction in which it becomes easier to imagine getting rid of, you know, the cumbersome apparatus of democracy. And when you think about it, I mean, so much of what we think of as neoliberalism now has already been about shielding meaningful public decisions from public oversight and accountability. So in one sense, like you don't have to do anything much more. And like in another sense, it's just a tiny step. So, you know, just get rid of it, John. Right.
Right. The representation has been, you know, pretty much severed.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. And the termites have eaten the house up.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I just want to thank you again so much for, you know, being here again at the New Haven Public Library.
Well, no, that's my pleasure. I just wish I were there live. I love that place.
Yeah. And we'll try to keep it going. And
by the way, on the last thing you were going to ask about the juggling, I don't know. Well, yeah, I mean, so yeah, I don't know if you noticed this, but like, well, yeah, the Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, right? You know, the philosopher has only interpreted the world, the point is to change it, is one that I've always read as much an epistemic principle as a moral one. And I think the only way really to know the world is to test its limits through practice.
And that is,
So,
book Marxists are not real Marxists.
right. Right. Thank you. So in that sense, like for me, and my friends who are still there in New Haven, who I've known since my early 30s, would attest to this too. Like they've always been parts of the same project for me.
You can't get this stuff out of a book. But you are working on 2 books that I just want to name.
Correct.
People can keep their eyes out. I believe early 2022 is the expected date for the first. And that's Reflections on the Jim Crow South, a non-memoir.
Correct.
I have that right. And the other is When Compromises Come Home to Roost, Decline and Transformation of the Left Since 1945.
Correct. And
And
they're both being published by Verso.
Verso.
Yep.
Terrific. I also am going to announce that we have another book sandwiched in coming up on March 4th, which will be with Yale professor Frank Snowden. He's going to be talking about epidemics and society.
Oh, interesting.
So that should be very interesting.
Yeah.
And then on March 12th, Karen Carbo will join us to discuss her book, In Praise of Difficult Women. So without further ado, everyone's dismissed. Thank you so much, Professor.
All right, thanks, Isaac. Thanks for having me, man. It's great to get to know you.
Yeah, you too.
And I trust we'll be in contact later.
We'd love to have you back. Thank you.